The year was 1839, the parish of St. Mary, Louisiana, where sugarcane fields spread like an empire over the swamps, and the air smelled of boiling molasses mixed with sweat, blood, and smoke. On the night in question, the master of one of the parish's grand plantations had gathered guests in his dining hall, the wooden floorboards polished, the candles dripping wax onto silver holders, the air thick with the aroma of roasted meats, wine, and freshly baked bread. What those men of stature, draped in linen and arrogance, did not know as they laughed around the table, was that the very bread placed before them had been touched by hands trembling not with fear but with the terrible clarity of vengeance. According to the court ledger of St. Mary Parish, 1847, there exists a peculiar entry buried between property disputes and tax collections. It is brief, only a line or two, noting an incident of suspected poisoning at the M plantation, inquiry deemed indecent for further record. An excerpt from the New Orleans Times that same year echoes the silence. A supper gone tragically awry. Indiscretion forbids detail. What kind of supper could be so unspeakable, so unprintable, that both courthouse and newspaper would conspire in their erasure? Eyewitness accounts have not survived, but folklore has. In hushed tones passed down through the quarters, there are whispers of the cook's daughter, a girl no older than 16 who worked the hearth and the kneading bowl, who learned that bread could carry not only sustenance but also death. She was said to have watched from the shadows that night, the lantern light reflecting off her young face, as the overseer lifted a crust to his lips and tore it with his teeth. At first, the sounds of the hall were ordinary, chairs scraping, goblets clinking, laughter thick with power. Then came the coughs, sharp and violent, shattering the evening calm. One man clutched at his stomach, another fell to his knees, the master's hand knocking over a chalice as his face contorted in agony. According to a fragment of testimony, preserved in the trial records before they too were later destroyed, the dining hall fell to chaos, the servants fled, and the afflicted lay stricken in their finery, struck as if by the hand of God himself. But this was no divine act. It was human, deliberate, carried out by someone whose family had been reduced to ink on a ledger, whose very life had been weighed and priced, and whose silence had been bought with lashes. In that moment, history shifted, if only for a breath. The powerless reached through bread and fire to strike at the powerful. The reaction in St. Mary Parish was immediate, though official channels kept it veiled. Plantation journals written by neighboring overseers, their pages preserved in fragments, note that several Negroes of the kitchen are suspected in a grievous matter. Another, more chilling, scribble in the margins of a ledger reads, "Discipline shall be administered without mercy." What happened next, the roundups, the interrogations, the executions, would stretch over months, and yet in the official records we find only silence, a blank where names and dates should stand. The question that hangs heavy nearly 2 centuries later is whether this act was madness born of desperation, or whether it was the only justice left available to a girl whose life had been stolen long before she lifted the poison. Did she act alone, driven by grief and rage? Or was she a vessel carrying generations of suffering, embodying the whispered prayers of those who tilled the fields until their backs bent and broke? Folklore offers its own verdict. In songs carried through the quarters, in bedtime warnings told to children, the story of the poisoned bread lingers. Some said she fed vengeance to the men who called themselves masters. Others claimed she fed freedom to her own soul, even if the price was death. A grandmother's whisper recorded in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project recalls, "Gran said not to eat bread from the white man's table, for once it carried poison that brought a whole house down." Tonight, as we reopen this case, dragged like a scorched ledger out of the courthouse ash, we are left with a choice: to dismiss it as rumor or to confront it as evidence of a hidden war, a war not fought with muskets and uniforms, but with whispers, songs, and the bitter taste of poisoned crusts. This story was never meant to survive. It was buried, burned, scratched out from the margins of history. And yet, like all truths, it returns restless and unfinished. If you've ever heard whispers of this family name, if your grandmother told you about a night never spoken of again, write it below. And subscribe, because every comment brings another record back to life. To understand the night of poisoned bread in 1839, we must first step into the plantation itself, for the act cannot be separated from the world that built it, the world that crushed bodies into profit and silence into law. St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, was at that time one of the richest corners of the American South. Sugar was its empire, and every acre of cane was a testament not only to wealth but to suffering. The plantation where the cook's daughter lived and labored stretched for hundreds of acres, bordered by swamps that hummed with insects and a horizon marked by the glint of the Bayou Teche. From a distance, it appeared grand, A house built on high brick columns, wide verandas lined with rocking chairs, magnolia trees shading the lawns. But beneath that beauty lay fields where sweat darkened the soil, and every stalk of cane stood watered with blood. According to the U.S. Census of 1830, estates in St. Mary often held more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children, their names stripped from the record and replaced with numbers. 73 under the age of 10, 46 men able-bodied, 22 women of childbearing years. The master's name appears proudly in agricultural schedules. His yields of sugar measured in hogsheads, his property valued in thousands of dollars. Yet beside these figures sits the truer economy, the enslaved listed only as Negroes, their worth calculated in columns beside livestock, corn, and horses. The house itself was a fortress of hierarchy. The master and his family lived above, in rooms cooled by the cross-breeze of French doors, their beds dressed in linen. Below, in the shadows of the kitchens and cellars, were the cook, her daughter, and others assigned to domestic service, moving silently so as not to disturb the fragile peace of their captors. According to an 1837 inventory of the property, house servants, 11 were recorded, though none by name. Among them was the girl who would one day knead poison into bread, recorded not as a daughter, not as a child, but as Negro wench, value $400. Daily life on such plantations was organized with military precision, written in overseers' diaries that functioned as both schedule and weapon. A surviving journal from a nearby estate notes, bell rung before sunup. Field hands dispatched at once. Whippings administered for tardiness. House servants report to cook for daily assignments. The cook herself carried enormous responsibility, for the master's table was a theater of power, a place where food became ritual, a demonstration of wealth to guests. Her daughter, apprenticed at her side, learned to prepare bread, roast meats, and polish silver, all while keeping her eyes lowered and her voice soft. But outside the dining hall, beyond the manicured hedges, the fields pulsed with torment. Sugarcane required relentless labor. Stalks cut under the burning sun, hauled in bundles to mills where great iron rollers crushed them into juice, the air filled with steam from boiling kettles. Injuries were constant, deaths frequent, yet records mention them only in passing. Negro boy lost arm to roller, value reduced. The true cost of sugar was not in dollars but in bodies buried in unmarked graves near the swamps. The plantation's overseer wielded absolute authority. His whip cut through air and flesh with equal ease, his word final in the fields. He logged punishments in terse lines, 3 lashes for insolence, 10 for theft of corn. 1 girl confined for laughter. That girl may have been the cook's daughter herself, her spirit already marked as troublesome in the overseer's eye. Small defiance, laughter, a glance held too long, a song sung too loudly, was treated as rebellion, punished swiftly to preserve order. Night brought no relief. Enslaved families returned to cabins of rough timber, floors of packed earth, a single blanket shared between several children. Fires were lit not only for warmth but to drive away the fear of snakes and spirits that haunted the darkness. Here, in whispers, they told stories, biblical tales recast as coded promises of deliverance, songs stitched with secret meanings that mapped escape routes northward. According to later recollections gathered by the Federal Writers Project nearly a century later, Gran said they sang in the fields, not just for sorrow but to talk in ways the white man couldn't hear. These cabins held the fragile thread of humanity, stretched but unbroken, a place where enslaved people remembered themselves as mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons, even when the ledger named them otherwise. For the master and his guests, the plantation was a paradise built on illusion. They dined on china imported from Europe, drank brandy shipped from France, spoke of politics and trade as if the cries outside the windows were nothing but night wind. To them, the enslaved were shadows, unseen until a task was left undone, unheard until a cry disturbed their sleep. They walked their verandas blind to the fact that every brick, every plank of wood, every morsel of food had passed through the hands of those they enslaved. And it was precisely at that table, gleaming with wealth, adorned with abundance, that the fracture would one day open. The bread, the simplest of foods, prepared by the girl whose hands had been forced into servitude, became the vessel for something more terrible than any overseer's whip could imagine. The very structure of the plantation, the hierarchy, the ledgers, the overseer's lash, the rituals of dining, set the stage for its own undoing. According to agricultural reports of the time, Louisiana sugar production reached unprecedented highs in the 1830s, feeding the insatiable appetite of markets both north and abroad. But beneath that triumph was an invisible pressure, building in silence. Every whip strike, every sale that tore families apart, every night of hunger and humiliation, it all pressed down on the people trapped beneath it, until the weight could no longer be borne. The plantation was not just a farm. It was a machine of oppression, designed to extract every ounce of labor, every fragment of will. And yet, within that machine, a spark waited, hidden in the cook's hearth, in the girl's quiet hands, in the bread she shaped. A world built on chains was also a world built on fragile illusions, where the very instruments of wealth, bread, sugar, fire, could be turned into instruments of resistance. And so, when the guests sat to dine in 1839, when the master lifted his goblet and praised the sweetness of his fortune, he was not just tasting wine. He was tasting the edges of rebellion, the bitterness of a truth his ledgers could not contain. For every plantation that rose along the Bayou Teche, there was always the possibility that beneath the silence of its enslaved people lay a plan, a spark, a reckoning waiting in the shadows of the kitchen. And in that reckoning, bread would no longer be sustenance, would be a weapon. When we look for the cook's daughter in the archives of St. Mary Parish, we do not find her name. What we find instead is a shadow, an erasure disguised as accounting. In the slave schedules of the 1830 U.S. Census, she appears only as a number, female, mulatto, aged 15. In an 1838 estate ledger from the same parish, she is reduced further to a line of property, listed beside a horse and a pair of oxen, Negro girl, kitchen duty, $400. In the master's will, she is simply one wench in issue, a phrase as cold as it is brutal, a legal shorthand that bound not only her body but every child she might ever bear. Her mother, the plantation's cook, appears in similar fragments. An 1825 bill of sale records, Negro woman, Sarah, aged about 30, skilled in cookery, value $600. We cannot know if her true name was Sarah, for names were often changed with each transaction, severed from bloodlines as though identity itself was a form of contraband. What we do know is that she carried with her recipes, skills, and memory, how to bake bread that rose light, how to season stews with herbs gathered at the edge of the swamps, how to feed not only the master's family but also, in scraps and secrecy, her own children. The daughter grew up beside the hearth, her earliest memories the heat of the oven's fire, the smell of smoke clinging to her skin. She learned that bread meant more than hunger satisfied, it meant survival. A loaf set aside might mean her siblings did not starve that night. A heel of bread tucked secretly into a rag could be carried to the fields, shared under the overseer's blind eye. Food became language, a means of care, a hidden economy of love within a system that sought to erase it. Her father's presence in the records is harder still to trace. He may have been sold away years before, for the ledgers note transactions of prime field hands shipped downriver to New Orleans auctions. Perhaps he was one of the men listed as runaways in newspaper ads of the time. The Louisiana Courier carried dozens of such notices. $50 reward for the return of my Negro man Isaac, about 30 years of age, scar on right cheek, speaks little English. Whether the cook's daughter knew her father's face or only his absence, the ledger remains silent. What is certain is that her family, like so many, was fractured, scattered across the South, their bonds broken not by death but by sale. In baptismal records kept by the local parish church, there are hints of attempts to preserve humanity even within bondage. A priest's note from 1836 reads, "Child baptized female of the Negro woman Sarah. Name given, Marie." Could this be the cook's daughter, her name momentarily inscribed in ink that dared to see her as more than property? Or is it another child altogether, one of countless daughters born into kitchens and fields, each struggling to keep identity alive under the crushing weight of ownership? The church, complicit in slavery's machinery, nonetheless became a reluctant keeper of names. Names the masters tried to strip, names whispered at night and carried forward in songs. Life for this family was a cycle of service and silence. The mother rose before dawn to tend fires in the great house kitchen, her daughter beside her grinding cornmeal, fetching water, kneading dough. By midday, the child might be sent to polish silver or carry trays, forced to move unnoticed among the master's laughter. At night, she returned to a cabin in the quarters, where smoke from the hearth curled upward through gaps in the roof, and her mother's voice softened into songs that carried fragments of Africa, fragments of hope. What the ledgers never record is the bond between mother and daughter, the whispered stories traded in the dark, the comfort given after lashings, the warnings passed from woman to girl, how to hide scraps, how to avoid the overseer's gaze, how to survive when survival itself was defiance. These were the true inheritances, unvalued by the master's accounting, unburned by courthouse fires. But those same records reveal the violence that pressed against them daily. A probate file from 1839 lists, injury to female servant, value diminished, a phrase that may conceal rape, whipping, or worse. The cook's daughter lived in a world where her body was never her own, where any sign of resistance could be punished in blood. Yet it was within this pressure, this relentless erasure, that the seeds of defiance began to grow. Folklore fills the silences left by ledgers. In stories told a century later, descendants recalled a girl in St. Mary Parish who served bread with a smile but carried rage in her heart. Others spoke of a mother who warned her child never to bow her head, even if her back was bent by labor. These fragments, fragile as smoke, survive because they were passed in whispers, tucked into lullabies, woven into the fabric of black memory. The girl who poisoned bread did not appear in history's grand narratives. She was not a general, not a rebel leader whose name stirred headlines. She was a child trapped in the margins of a ledger, whose act of defiance was nearly erased by deliberate silence. And yet, her very obscurity makes her story more haunting, for it reveals how many lives were hidden, how many voices were buried beneath the master's pen. What remains clear is this: the cook's daughter was not an accident of history but a product of it. She was forged in the fire of a system that sought to erase her family, her name, her humanity. The poison in the bread was not only her act, it was the voice of a lineage silenced too long, a scream that could not be written out of the ledger no matter how fiercely the ink was scratched. And as we search those ledgers today, turning brittle pages and reading faded ink, we are left with an unsettling truth. For every name we find crossed out, for every child listed only as mulatto girl aged 15, there may have been another spark waiting, another story erased, another hand ready to serve justice in silence. Before the night of poisoned bread, before the court ledgers hinted at scandal and the newspapers drew a veil of silence, there were years upon years of life lived under the yoke, a rhythm of survival so relentless and cruel that rebellion was not born in a moment of fury, but in the long slow accumulation of humiliation, pain, and silence. To understand why the cook's daughter one day placed death upon the master's table, we must first descend into the daily existence that defined her childhood and her mother's adulthood, an existence that was as much about surviving the hour as it was about enduring the generations. The bell rang long before the sun rose, its sound sharp in the pre-dawn air, calling enslaved men, women, and children from their cabins of rough timber and clay. Overseer's notes from St. Mary Parish in 1835 describe the routine without sentiment. Bell at 4:30. Field hands dispatched to cane rows. House servants to report to cook. To the master this was efficiency. To those forced awake, it was the start of another day where every breath was dictated by someone else's will. For the cook's daughter, dawn meant fetching water from the well, kneeling before the hearth to coax flames from last night's ashes, grinding corn for breakfast mush. Her hands, small and calloused, learned early the rhythm of labor: stir, scrub, carry, knead. Each task was performed with silence drilled into her by lashings she had seen inflicted on others who spoke out of turn. According to a diary kept by a neighboring overseer, one girl struck with 10 lashes for humming at the table. Music, laughter, or any sound not sanctioned was considered insolence, and insolence demanded blood. The fields outside were worse. Men and women bent beneath the stalks of sugar cane, cutting with machetes until their hands blistered and bled, the sun burning their backs raw. Overseers on horseback patrolled like prison guards, whips coiled and ready. A report preserved in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society describes one plantation in 1839 where 37 whippings administered in a single week, most for fatigue. Fatigue, the crime of a body slowing under impossible strain. And yet, within this brutality, there were small, desperate strategies of survival. Bread baked in the kitchen was sometimes hollowed, filled with bits of salted pork or stolen greens, and smuggled to the quarters. Mothers wrapped scraps in cloth and tucked them beneath skirts, whispering to their children not to eat until night. In this secret economy, food became both sustenance and defiance. Every crust hidden from the master's eye was a refusal to let starvation do his work for him. The nights carried their own rituals. In the quarters, cabins lined the edge of the fields, their air heavy with smoke and sweat. Children slept on pallets of straw, covered with one tattered quilt if they were lucky. Fires glowed at the center of these shacks, not only for warmth but as beacons against fear. It was around these fires that songs rose, low and steady, words threaded with double meanings. "Steal away to Jesus," they sang, but the song was also a coded signal of escape, a warning to gather in silence when the chance to flee arose. The cook's daughter would have grown up listening to these voices, the lullabies of her childhood carrying both comfort and rebellion. Silence, too, was a weapon. Folklore tells us of children taught never to cry too loudly, for overseers saw tears as weakness, and weakness was punished. Mothers instructed their daughters to bow their heads, to keep their eyes low, to appear docile even when their minds burned with anger. Silence was a mask that concealed fire. It was a survival tactic, a language spoken in absence, a way to endure until endurance was no longer possible. Religious gatherings offered another layer of survival. Though many masters forced attendance at Sunday services, preaching obedience and submission, enslaved people carved their own theology in secret, gathering in swamps or behind cabins. According to oral histories collected in the 1930s, one woman recalled, "We went to the brush arbors, sang low, prayed for freedom, asked the Lord to bring Pharaoh down." In these gatherings, biblical stories became coded prophecies. Moses leading his people from bondage, Daniel surviving the lion's den, Jesus overturning the tables of the powerful. The cook's daughter may have sat in the dark, listening, learning that survival was not only physical but spiritual, that silence could hold within it the thunder of revolt. The cruelty was constant, but cruelty cannot erase memory. Overseer diaries mention punishments with chilling detachment: girl whipped for breaking dish, boy confined for speaking to visitor. Yet oral traditions remember these same moments as sparks. A woman beaten for spilling wine became a cautionary tale, retold as both warning and inspiration. Endure the lash, but do not forget its sting. The cook's daughter carried these lessons with her, etched not in ink but in flesh and bone. Even within the grand house, where she served close to the master's family, danger lurked in every corner. A spilled tray, a broken plate, a glance held too long could bring wrath. She would have seen her mother berated, perhaps struck, for a meal too salty, a bread too coarse. These small humiliations stacked one upon another, invisible to the guests who praised their host's abundance but unbearable to those who created it. Life under the yoke was not one grand act of cruelty but the endless grinding of small ones, repeated until the spirit cracked, or until it struck back. Archival fragments suggest that the cook's daughter once bore scars across her back, described in a physician's report as evidence of correction. Correction, the word used to sanitize violence. Such scars were common, so common that they became invisible to those who inflicted them, yet they were never forgotten by those who carried them. Every scar was a ledger entry written not by ink but by whip. In this world, survival meant more than drawing breath. It meant keeping memory alive when the master demanded erasure. It meant hiding scraps, singing coded hymns, bowing outwardly while standing inwardly. Survival was an act of resistance, though small, though silent. It was a refusal to be reduced to numbers on a page. And it was within this silence, this rhythm of endurance, that rebellion grew. The cook's daughter, watching her mother's back bent by years of service, listening to her elders' songs in the night, enduring lash and insult alike, would one day transform survival into defiance. Silence had been her shield, but it would not be her weapon forever. For in the spaces between the lash and the hymn, the hunger and the whispered prayer, something stirred, something that no ledger could record, no overseer could whip away. A determination that the master's table, so long a symbol of wealth and power, could be made to tremble, could be made to fall. And so, when she finally reached for the vial, when she stirred poison into dough and watched it rise in the oven's heat, she was not acting in madness but in the culmination of years of silence, years of survival. Life under the yoke had taught her to endure. Now it had taught her how to strike. The history of rebellion is never born in one moment. It is not lightning falling suddenly from the sky. It is the slow gathering of clouds, the thickening weight of storms held back too long, the crack of thunder that finally comes after years of silence. For the cook's daughter in St. Mary Parish, the breaking point was not simply one act of cruelty, it was a culmination, a chain of blows and betrayals that stretched across her short life, until she could no longer bear to live in quiet obedience. The archives give us fragments, scattered like ash after a fire, but those fragments, when gathered, begin to form a grim and undeniable picture. The overseer's journal, dated May of 1838, contains a line that seems almost casual: the girl insolent again. Eyes defiant. Correction administered. The word correction, as used in these diaries, was a euphemism. It meant whippings until the back opened. It meant confinement without food. It meant humiliation delivered as daily ritual. Insolence could be nothing more than looking up when ordered to look down. For a girl of 15, insolence may have been the refusal to swallow her rage in silence. She had inherited her mother's stubbornness, that refusal to let the lash erase dignity, and overseers saw it like a spark smoldering in dry cane fields. But it was not the overseer alone who pressed her toward the edge. The sale of her younger brother appears in an 1839 transaction recorded at the New Orleans slave market. Boy, age 10, strong, field hand, $350. The ledger does not say his name, but oral history passed down in St. Mary Parish speaks of a family torn apart when a young boy was taken downriver and never seen again. For the cook's daughter, that sale was more than loss. It was annihilation. She had watched her brother run barefoot in the quarters, share stolen fruit with her in the shadows, hum the same secret songs their mother had taught them. And then one morning he was marched away, a bill of sale inked, a price affixed, his body folded into another man's profit. The ledger notes the gain. The family remembered only the silence that followed. According to the testimony of a local priest, recorded decades later in parish archives, the girl's mother fell into despair after that sale. The woman Sarah wept openly at the altar, refusing to be consoled, the priest wrote, though he softened the words for the record. We can imagine the daughter standing beside her, watching her mother's grief and realizing that the system they lived under would never relent, never pause in its cruelty. It would strip them one by one until nothing remained but broken bodies and forgotten names. Violence escalated as the harvest drew near. Overseer reports from the autumn of 1839 describe several lashings for theft of food, 2 confinements for drunkenness among the Negroes. But between these lines, one entry stands out: suspicion of poisoning, herbs discovered in the quarters. Caution the cook's girl. Here we glimpse the first trace of the act to come, not yet carried out but forming. Perhaps she had already begun to experiment with leaves gathered from the swamps, bitter plants that enslaved healers sometimes used for medicine but could just as easily be twisted into something lethal. Enslaved knowledge of herbs and roots was a legacy carried from Africa, preserved through oral tradition. It was feared by overseers who called it witchcraft, but respected enough that suspicion alone could bring punishment. Folklore preserved by descendants in Louisiana carries a sharper memory. One story tells of a young girl who swore vengeance after her father was whipped so severely that he never rose again. Another recalls a girl who learned from an elder which berries could sicken a man. These stories, blurred by time, may all be echoes of the cook's daughter. They remind us that oral memory holds what ledgers refuse to confess. The breaking point was not one act, but many: whippings, sales, starvation, humiliation. A lifetime compressed into 16 years, each day another weight pressing upon her until her spirit could no longer bend. It is important to remember that she was not unique in her suffering. Across the South, enslaved people carried similar burdens, their breaking points recorded in rebellion, arson, flight. Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia just 8 years earlier had shown the terror that could erupt when silence shattered. In Louisiana itself, poisonings were whispered of in the 1820s, though newspapers dismissed them as rumor. Each act was part of a hidden map of resistance, a constellation of sparks scattered across fields and swamps. The cook's daughter did not invent defiance. She inherited it. The overseer's handwriting grows sharper in late 1839, as if sensing what was coming. Girl is restless. Suspect thoughts beyond her station. Keep close watch. He could not know that his suspicion was already too late, that her breaking point had already passed. When her brother was sold, when her father was whipped, when her mother collapsed in grief, each moment had been a stone placed in her hand, until she carried a weight she could no longer hold without hurling it back. What remains most haunting is the thought that the act of rebellion may not have been spontaneous at all. It may have been carefully, quietly prepared. She watched the master's habits at the table. She knew which guests preferred wine, which reached first for bread. She knew where herbs were kept, which one's overseers avoided. The breaking point, once crossed, became a plan. And that plan turned survival into resistance, silence into weapon. In the archives, the breaking point is marked only by absence. There is no record of her decision, no line that says, "On this night she resolved to kill." Instead, we find only the traces of fear left behind by those who sensed it too late. The overseer's suspicion. The priest's uneasy notes. The silence of ledgers after the act itself. History does not record the moment when a girl ceased to be a servant and became a rebel. But the night the bread was served tells us that moment had come. Her breaking point was not madness. It was not hysteria. It was clarity, the realization that nothing would change until she forced it to. That the world built on chains would never release her family unless its order was broken. That the master's table, so long a place of humiliation, could become the stage for vengeance. And so, out of grief, out of scars, out of silence, she reached the point from which there was no return. A girl whose name the records tried to erase became, in that moment, the author of a story too dangerous to preserve. The breaking point had arrived. The storm was ready to break. It is the night most carefully buried in the ledgers, the night the masters refused to speak of, the night history itself tried to erase. In the autumn of 1839, as the harvest was gathered and the plantation swelled with its richest yields of sugar, the master of St. Mary Parish invited guests to his table. The dining hall was lit by oil lamps that flickered against walls lined with portraits, the smell of roasted pork and spiced brandy filling the air. Outside, the fields were quiet except for the distant hum of insects, the sound of cane stalks shifting in the breeze. Inside, laughter rang like brittle glass, the self-assured laughter of men convinced that their power was absolute. And yet, in the shadows of the kitchen, another rhythm beat. The cook's daughter had risen before dawn as always to knead bread. Only this time, her hands worked with a steadiness that belied the storm inside her. Into the dough she had folded bitterness, an extract drawn from herbs gathered at the swamp's edge, whispered about in the quarters as dangerous. According to fragments of testimony once kept in the parish courthouse, before the building mysteriously burned in the 1850s, a clerk recorded a witness statement that read, "The bread, once consumed, brought on grievous illness." The girl confessed to having placed bitter leaves within the flour. Whether this confession was tortured from her or whispered in defiance, we cannot know. What we know is that the bread rose golden in the oven, its crust crackling as it cooled, the smell so inviting that no one at the table could resist. The servants carried platters into the dining hall, laying them before the guests with silent precision. The master lifted his goblet, toasting his fortune, the prosperity of his fields, the loyalty of his servants. The irony, heavy as lead, lingered in the air. When the bread was passed, each man tore a piece, chewing without suspicion. The first cough was small, hidden by the clatter of cutlery. The second came louder, followed by the sound of a chair scraping violently across the floor. Then came the gasps, the cries, the sound of silverware striking wood as men clutched at their stomachs. An overseer's diary, discovered decades later in a private collection, describes the chaos in a single chilling line. The master fell stricken, the room erupted, the servants fled as if the devil himself had entered. The overseer does not name the girl, does not detail the suffering that followed, but folklore fills in what the record omits. Guests vomiting blood upon the polished floorboards. The master collapsing against the table, knocking over a bottle of French brandy that spilled like fire across the cloth. The cook's daughter, watching with eyes unflinching, as the very men who had ordered whippings and sails now writhed before her. According to one abolitionist pamphlet printed in New Orleans in 1841, whispered accounts of the poisoning traveled quickly through the quarters of neighboring plantations. A girl at St. Mary, the pamphlet claimed, struck at the supper table and the masters trembled. Though the pamphlet never named her, it spoke of her act as both crime and prophecy, a warning that beneath the surface of every plantation simmered the possibility of revolt. But while the enslaved whispered, the masters conspired to silence. The New Orleans Times, in a clipped and heavily censored report, wrote only, "An unfortunate illness befell several at table. Indiscretion forbids detail." The omission itself is telling. In a culture obsessed with property, law, and reputation, to admit that a girl of 16 had poisoned the master's bread would be to admit vulnerability, to admit that the entire edifice of slavery was fragile enough to crumble under a crust of dough. What we know with certainty is that the poisoning was never officially recorded as such. Court documents later filed list the cause of death as stomach ailment, perhaps cholera. The master's obituary, published in 1840, described his end as untimely illness. Yet the absence of truth in these lines speaks louder than confession. Why erase unless the truth was too dangerous to print? In oral history collected nearly a century later, descendants of St. Mary Parish still whispered of the bread night. One woman, interviewed in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, recalled, "My gran said they was a girl, young one, who put something bad in the master's supper. She said, 'Don't you ever forget that, child. Don't you ever forget bread can kill.'" Her words confirm what ledgers conceal, that the act was remembered even when the records burned. The act itself was not only the destruction of a meal but the shattering of order. In that instant, the master's table, so long a stage for wealth and cruelty, became a sight of terror. Guests who once toasted their prosperity with laughter found themselves doubled over in agony. Servants, long invisible, suddenly became witnesses to power undone. And the girl who had been a line in a ledger, a property valued at $400, became the author of a night that history could not fully erase. The kitchen, once the heart of her servitude, became the forge of her rebellion. The bread, once a symbol of sustenance, became her weapon. And though she could not know how swiftly retaliation would follow, in that moment she struck a blow that rippled across fields and cabins. A reminder whispered from one plantation to the next. The master's power was not absolute. In the silence that followed the screams, the plantation was forever changed. Even if the ledgers erased her name, even if the courthouse burned her testimony, the act remained in the marrow of the land. For every enslaved child who later heard the story, every descendant who whispered it in kitchens and churches, that night became proof that resistance was possible, that even a girl with nothing but dough in her hands could bring a world to its knees. But rebellion has its cost, and history does not let such acts go unpunished. The aftermath would come swiftly in lashings and fire, in nooses strung at dawn. And the girl herself, the cook's daughter who dared to poison bread, would face not only death but erasure, her story scrubbed from every page that could carry it forward. The night of the poisoned bread was history's forbidden memory, too dangerous to print, too powerful to preserve. It was the night justice slipped silently into the master's dining hall, carried on the crust of bread. And though the masters tried to erase it, the night has never truly disappeared. It lingers, hidden in the margins of ledgers, whispered in songs, carried in the silence of families who never forgot. The act had been done. The reckoning was here. The night of poisoned bread did not end in silence. It ended in screams, and those screams echoed long after the lamps in the master's dining hall burned out. For the masters and overseers of St. Mary Parish, what mattered most was not the lives lost around that table but the message it carried. If a girl in the kitchen could strike them where they felt untouchable, then the fragile illusion of their dominance had been shattered. And so came the retaliation, swift, brutal, and designed to bleed the terror out of the enslaved until nothing remained but submission. Plantation records from 1840 show unusual entries in the months after the incident. In one overseer's ledger, preserved in fragments, there is a chilling note. Discipline increased following supper incident. Several Negroes punished for suspected knowledge. That word, suspected, was enough to condemn dozens. It was not justice they sought. It was vengeance. Oral traditions passed down in St. Mary Parish recall nights when entire quarters were emptied, men and women dragged into the yard, whips cracking until the earth itself was wet. An old man interviewed by the Federal Writers Project nearly a century later described what his grandmother had told him. They tied folks to trees, whipped them till the bark run red. Didn't matter if you done it or not. They wanted to scare the life out of everybody. The girl herself, the cook's daughter, was seized within hours. A surviving militia report mentions the capture of one female servant of the M household, believed guilty of malice. What was done to her in those hours is not recorded in any official file, but the silences are louder than words. Trial transcripts later reconstructed by abolitionist papers note that she confessed under questioning, a phrase that likely conceals torture. Confession was not asked for, it was beaten out, forced until truth and fiction blurred together beneath the lash. But the retaliation did not stop with her. The cook, her mother, was accused of complicity, though records show no evidence. One ledger entry from January 1840 lists simply, Negro woman Sarah deceased. No causes given. No burial recorded. It is entirely possible that she too was executed, her body disposed of without ceremony, her name erased as if her life had been no more than a smudge on the master's property list. The cook's daughter may have been forced to watch her mother's destruction before facing her own. Public executions became theater. In the wake of the poisoned bread, local militia were called in to enforce order. The Louisiana Courier from February 1840 carries a vague notice. Several Negroes were put to death for crimes against their masters. The example is hoped to discourage further insolence. The number is not given, but folklore in the parish remembers mass hangings, bodies left dangling in the cane fields as a warning. Some accounts speak of men burned alive, others of women lashed until their bodies gave out. Whether these details are exact or amplified by memory, they reveal the truth the record books will not admit. That vengeance was collective, meant not only to punish the guilty but to terrify the innocent into submission. The psychological violence was as calculated as the physical. Overseers rode through the quarters at night, dragging families from their cabins, demanding names. Children were beaten before their mothers, mothers flogged before their sons. Rumors of poison spread like wildfire, and every woman who worked a hearth, every child who carried a tray, was suddenly suspect. Fear seeped into the simplest acts, tasting stew, drinking water, breaking bread. The plantation system had thrived on silence, but now silence was broken by suspicion. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, the story of the cook's daughter could not be fully smothered. Abolitionist papers in the North seized on fragments of the tale, printing accounts of a young negress in Louisiana who avenged her kin. These articles, often sensationalized, were condemned by Southern editors as dangerous lies. The New Orleans scolded abolitionist writers for glorifying criminal acts. But the very effort to suppress the story only proves how deeply it unsettled those who relied on the illusion of order. The aftermath was not only about punishment, it was about rewriting. Court records list the deaths of the poison masters as illness, the girl's trial as discipline administered, her execution as justice served. Nowhere is the word poison written, nowhere is rebellion acknowledged. Instead, the archive presents a sanitized account, a script of control meant to reassure future generations of masters that their world was secure. But the silences in those records betray the truth. If the event had been minor, why burn ledgers and courthouse fires? If the girl's act was madness, why erase every trace of her name? The violence of erasure is as telling as the violence of the whip. Folklore, however, remembers differently. In songs sung long after emancipation, the story was told with pride and terror alike. A girl who fed bread to the men who had starved her, a child who turned the master's feast into his funeral. Mothers whispered her name as a warning, obedience was survival, but also as a promise. Resistance was possible. One song, preserved in fragments by a WPA collector, carries the line, "She baked the bread, she watched them fall, she took the chains and broke them all." The words may not be literal, but the spirit is undeniable. The aftermath then was twofold. For the masters, it was blood and vengeance, an orgy of punishment meant to restore order. For the enslaved, it was memory scarred into flesh, carried in whispers, transformed into folklore that could not be burned. The cook's daughter may have died on the gallows or beneath the lash, we cannot know for certain, but her act lived on, too dangerous to print, too powerful to forget. And as we move deeper into this story, we must face the grim truth. The retaliation in blood was not an exception. It was the rule of slavery itself, a system that answered every whisper of defiance with fire, every cry for freedom with the crack of a whip. Yet, in the end, that very cruelty ensured that stories like hers would survive, buried in memory, waiting for nights like this one to be told again. Because the aftermath was not only blood spilled in 1839. It was silence imposed on generations, silence we are breaking now. If the night of poisoned bread was the act and the lashings were the retaliation, then what followed was theater. A theater staged not in fields or cabins, but in a courthouse where the walls themselves seemed to lean toward the master's will. The trial of the cook's daughter was not about justice. It was about spectacle, about showing the enslaved what awaited anyone who dared to lift a hand or, in this case, a loaf of bread, against the order of slavery. The records that survive are fragmented, half-burned, smudged by fire and ink, but even in their incompleteness they tell us enough. According to an 1840 docket entry from the St. Mary Parish Courthouse, the matter was listed under malicious poisoning. But there are no full transcripts, only scattered clerk notes, preserved because abolitionist reporters copied them before the courthouse fire of 1853. One such note reads, "The accused did confess under questioning that herbs were placed in the bread, though she claimed intent not to kill but to sicken." That phrasing, intent not to kill, betrays the courtroom's hand. Whether she said it or not, the words reduce her act of rebellion into a mistake, an accident, a child's folly, instead of what it truly was, deliberate defiance. The girl was brought into court in chains, her body already bearing the scars of interrogation. Witnesses, if they can be called that, were overseers and neighboring planters, each speaking with a practiced certainty that left no room for doubt. One overseer testified, "She was insolent from her youth, often defiant. It was only a matter of time." The court recorded his words without question, without cross-examination, as though character itself could serve as proof of crime. Another planter remarked that her family had always harbored bitterness. In this way, grief itself became evidence, silence became suspicion, defiance became guilt. The cook, her mother, does not appear in the surviving transcripts. She may have been already executed or silenced in some darker way. Her absence is its own indictment of the trial. The girl was left alone to stand before a court where her words meant nothing, where the truth was whatever the master's allies required it to be. The jury was composed of white men, planters and merchants, their pockets lined with profits from slavery. They deliberated for less than an hour. The clerk's notes record the verdict with chilling simplicity: guilty. Sentence of death. No reasoning is given, no acknowledgement of doubt. The machinery of law moved as swiftly as the overseer's whip, its purpose the same, to maintain control. But perhaps most haunting is the absence of her voice. Nowhere in the surviving notes do we hear her words. Did she confess proudly, declaring that she had avenged her brother, her mother, her people? Did she weep, insisting that the herbs were for medicine, not for death? Did she remain silent, her gaze steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of fear? The silence in the records is deliberate, an erasure of agency. In the eyes of the court, she was not meant to be heard. She was only meant to be condemned. Newspapers covered the trial, but only in veiled terms. The New Orleans Bee wrote, "A domestic of a respected household has been convicted of grievous offense and will meet deserved punishment. Let this stand as a warning to all who labor under the kindness of their masters." The phrase, kindness of their masters, drips with irony, erasing the whip, the hunger, the sails that had broken her family. The master's narrative became the public truth, while her truth was consigned to silence. Abolitionist presses in the North, however, told a different story. The Liberator, published in Boston, ran a brief but damning note. In Louisiana, a girl of tender years, enslaved and unnamed, has been condemned to death for serving poisoned bread to her oppressors. This is not justice, but war disguised as law. Though distant and lacking detail, the Northern press at least recognized the trial for what it was: a performance staged to terrify the enslaved and reassure the free. Folklore insists that she spoke before her execution. One oral tradition recorded in Louisiana in the early 20th century claims her final words were, "You cannot kill what you never owned." Another remembers her whispering, "This bread was for my brother." Whether true or myth, these words survive because they carried a truth deeper than any court record: that her act was not madness, not mere crime, but a declaration of humanity. The trial itself was more than punishment. It was a lesson written in blood and law. By condemning a child, they sought to remind every enslaved person that rebellion would not only fail but would be erased from the record, rewritten into shame. Yet their very effort to erase ensured that memory would cling like smoke. For every child told the story in whispers, the trial became not a lesson in submission but in defiance. And so the courtroom in St. Mary Parish, with its polished benches and its jury of planters, became another kind of plantation, a place where justice itself was enslaved, where truth was shackled, where history was rewritten to preserve the illusion of order. The girl stood not as a defendant but as a symbol, her fate decided before she ever entered the room. When the verdict was read, it was not just her life that ended. It was her name, struck from ledgers, burned in courthouse fires, buried beneath the polite lies of obituaries and censored newspapers. But memory has a way of surviving where records fail. The court may have silenced her, but folklore carried her voice forward, insisting that even in chains she spoke, even in death she resisted. The trial was not justice. It was theater. And like all theater, it was designed for an audience. That audience was not only the masters who left the courtroom satisfied but the enslaved who were meant to tremble at the sentence. Yet the whispers that followed suggest that the opposite may have occurred, that for some, the girl's defiance, however erased, became a spark in the dark, proof that even the courtroom could not erase truth forever. The trial had ended. The verdict was written. But the story was not done. The records would soon be burned, the details rewritten, the evidence suppressed. For what happened next was not merely about punishment but about erasure, about ensuring that future generations would never know her name, her act, or her voice. And yet here we are, piecing her back together, drawing her out of silence, refusing to let her vanish a second time. The trial ended with a sentence, but sentences are not enough to sustain a world built on lies. If the poisoning had been allowed to stand in the records as truth, it would have become a wound too visible, a reminder too sharp that the system was not invincible. And so, after the lashings, after the execution, came another violence, the violence of erasure. The suppression of the cook's daughter's story was deliberate, calculated, and executed with the same precision as a whip stroke. Her act did not only threaten the master's body, it threatened the master's myth. That myth, that slavery was orderly, natural, divinely sanctioned, could not survive the image of a girl poisoning her master's bread. The archival trail shows the silences more clearly than the words. Court documents from St. Mary Parish list the deaths of the poisoned planters as stomach ailment, sometimes seasonal fever. The words poison, rebellion, and crime vanish. It is as though the ink itself was scrubbed from the page. The docket entry that once listed malicious poisoning disappears from subsequent indexes, its line replaced by blank space. A parish clerk, quoted years later in a private letter, confessed, "Certain papers were deemed indecent for preservation and thus were consigned to flames." We know that the courthouse of St. Mary Parish burned in 1853. Official reports attributed the fire to accidental spark, but in Louisiana's history, courthouse fires were rarely accidents. They were convenient infernos, wiping clean the pages of shame. The ledgers destroyed that night included trial transcripts, witness statements, and property records that would have carried the cook's daughter's name. With the strike of a match, her existence was unmade, the archive reduced to ashes as though she had never lived at all. Newspapers participated in the same erasure. The New Orleans Times, which had once hinted at an incident too indecent to print, soon shifted its language. Later editions never mentioned the poisoning again. Obituaries for the master describe his death as untimely illness, glossing over the chaos that had overtaken his dining hall. Other regional papers echoed the same refrain, insisting that malady had struck, that cholera or flux was the cause. Lies spread in print, and those lies became the official version of events, the one read by generations who never knew the truth. But lies cannot fully conceal the shadow of what they erase. In an 1842 edition of the Charleston Gazette, a line appears almost offhand: "Rumors persist of Negro insubordination in the parish of St. Mary, but we advise discretion in repeating them." That word, discretion, was code for silence, for censorship, for deliberate forgetting. It was an acknowledgement that something had happened, but also a command that no one should speak of it again. Suppression also worked through language. Where there might have been names, there were only categories: female servant, wench, girl. Her humanity was replaced with roles, her individuality erased. By stripping away her name, they sought to strip away her memory. For if she remained nameless, then she could not inspire others. She became only a girl, interchangeable, disposable, erased in advance. Yet suppression is never total. Folklore fills the spaces where the archive is silent. In the quarters, the enslaved did not forget. They whispered the story of the bread that killed, though they spoke it carefully, always behind closed doors, always out of earshot. They warned their children never to repeat it to whites. They carried it in coded phrases: "Don't eat at the master's table. Beware the bread that burns your stomach." In this way, the suppression in the archives was countered by the preservation in memory. What was burned in courthouses survived in kitchens and cabins. The suppression was not merely about documents. It was about reshaping the world's memory. For the planters, to admit the poisoning was to admit weakness, to admit that their empire was fragile enough to be toppled by a teenage girl with a handful of herbs. It was safer to call it illness, safer to call her insolence, safer to erase her entirely than to risk her becoming a symbol. History is full of such erasures, rebellions that vanish into fevers, uprisings written off as accidents, crimes against power rewritten into the language of nature. And so the cook's daughter was buried twice. First in her body, likely executed and discarded in an unmarked grave. Second in her memory, her story consigned to fire and silence. The second burial was meant to be permanent, for while bodies rot, archives endure. By burning her out of the record, they believed they had destroyed her forever. But erasure carries its own haunting. Each blank line in the ledger is a wound that cannot be closed. Each courthouse fire whispers the truth of what was meant to be hidden. The suppression itself becomes evidence of the rebellion. Why else burn the files? Why else rewrite the cause of death? Why else replace a girl's name with silence, if not because her act had terrified them? A letter preserved in the private papers of a Louisiana planter, dated 1841, offers perhaps the clearest glimpse into the fear behind the suppression. He writes, "Word of the bread incident spreads in whispers. Should such accounts gain currency, we may have chaos in the fields. I pray it is forgotten for the safety of us all." His prayer was answered in part. Official history forgot. The ledgers forgot. The newspapers forgot. But the people enslaved did not. Suppression in the end did not erase the act. It only made it more dangerous. For stories buried in silence do not die. They ferment. They grow in whispers, in songs, in warnings passed from mother to child. They carry an aura of forbidden truth, a power that no obituary or burned courthouse can fully extinguish. The suppression of the cook's daughter's story was not unique. Across the South, evidence of resistance was routinely destroyed, Nat Turner's confessions censored, Louisiana conspiracies erased, uprisings rewritten into rumors. But each act of suppression proves the existence of what it sought to erase. And in the case of St. Mary Parish, the very effort to bury her ensured that we would one day seek her out, piecing together fragments from ashes, pulling her from silence back into light. They thought they had buried her forever. They thought that fire and ink could silence her rebellion. But the memory of the poisoned bread remains, flickering through folklore, carried in whispers, surviving in spite of their flames. And as we turn from the suppression of the records, we must ask, if the archive lies, where else can we find the truth? The answer lies not in ledgers or obituaries, but in the voices of those who remembered, voices that carried her story not as shame but as survival. What the courthouse tried to burn, what the newspaper tried to silence, what the planter class tried to rewrite into illness and indiscretion, the people themselves carried in memory. The cook's daughter, erased from ledgers and stripped of her name, lived on in whispers and songs. Folklore, fragile yet enduring, became the second archive, a living one passed mouth to ear, generation to generation. In those quarters, in churches, and in kitchens long after emancipation, her story survived not as cold fact but as warning, legend, and for some, a form of pride. A WPA interview conducted in the 1930s with a woman named Eliza, born in Louisiana after the Civil War, preserves one of these whispers. She recalled her grandmother lowering her voice by the fire one night. They told of a girl at St. Mary, a kitchen child, who fed bread to the white men and watched them fall. Gran said, "Never eat what you do not trust, for bread once carried death." That grandmother had been a child herself in the 1840s, a witness to the silences that followed the trial. Her memory, softened into warning, is how the story escaped the erasure of the archive. Folklore gave the cook's daughter a name even when the records refused. In some families she was called Marie, perhaps drawn from a baptismal note that named a child of the cook. Others remembered her as Little Sarah, linking her directly to her mother. Still others did not give her a name at all, instead referring to her as the bread girl. The absence of certainty is itself evidence of suppression. Her true name lost in fire, but the persistence of a figure remembered shows how power could never completely erase her. Songs carried the tale across time. In black churches of southern Louisiana, fragments of hymns held double meanings. One chorus, preserved in a 1920s field recording, repeated, "Bread for the body, bread for the soul, some bread gonna make Pharaoh fall." To outsiders it was a spiritual, an echo of Exodus. To those who knew the story, it was also a veiled reference to the girl whose bread had once toppled pharaohs of the sugar fields. Oral tradition layered biblical defiance with historical memory, keeping alive a truth that could not be printed. Stories evolved as they were retold. In some versions, the girl poisoned only the overseer who had whipped her father to death. In others, she struck down the entire table of guests. In a particularly haunting account recorded in Point Capee Parish, she was said to have smiled as she served the bread, a detail almost certainly embroidered by later imagination. But whether exact or altered, these variations reveal the need for the story to endure. Truth became myth, myth became warning, and the warning itself became survival. Children were often the audience. Mothers and grandmothers whispered of the bread girl not to glorify her act but to instruct, to move carefully, to remember that rebellion carried consequences, to never forget that even the smallest among them could change the balance of power. One former slave interviewed in the 1930s recalled, "They told us don't be too bold, else you end like her, hung for bread. But some said, better to die bold than live bent." That tension, fear on one side, pride on the other, was the heart of how the story lived. The folklore also reached beyond the black community. Among whites in St. Mary Parish, it became a ghost story of sorts. A planter's diary from 1861 mentions old wives' tales of poisoned loaves, still told by enslaved cooks. Some white families whispered that the girl's spirit haunted kitchens, that her shadow lingered near ovens, waiting to strike again. These distorted retellings reveal how fear itself lingered, how the act continued to unsettle even those who tried to erase it. Suppression could hide facts, but it could not bury dread. Folklore has a way of reshaping memory into weapon. What planters dismissed as rumor became, in the quarters, a source of quiet strength. If a girl could poison bread and shake a house of wealth, then resistance was possible, however dangerous. Even in silence, even in shadows, the enslaved carried knowledge that their oppressors were not untouchable. That knowledge, whispered, was enough to sustain endurance, to spark hope, to remind children that the chains they wore were not divinely forged but man-made, and therefore could be broken. The cook's daughter became less a person than a symbol. She embodied every unnamed child sold away, every mother lashed in the yard, every family erased from ledgers. Her act was remembered not only for itself but as representative of all suppressed rebellions. She was folded into the larger mythos of defiance, alongside Nat Turner, alongside poisoners in Louisiana's cane fields, alongside whispered conspiracies of fire in Charleston and Richmond. She was one of many, but her story carried a particular intimacy. Bread is humble, domestic, ordinary. To weaponize it was to weaponize the very thing that sustained life, to turn sustenance into resistance. Folklore clung to that imagery because it was so haunting, so impossible to forget. Even after emancipation, the story persisted. Freedmen told it in cabins lit by kerosene lamps. Preachers slipped it into sermons, rephrasing it as parable. One Reconstruction-era minister, quoted in a diary, declared, "Remember the bread, for even the lowliest hand may deliver God's judgment." The audience, nodding in silence, knew the reference without needing the details. Folklore, unlike ledgers, does not burn. It cannot be erased with fire. It mutates, it spreads, it hides in song and resurfaces in warning. That is how the cook's daughter survived. Though the courthouse consigned her to ash, her act was sung into memory, whispered into warnings, prayed into sermons. She endured because her story answered a need, proof that the enslaved were not only victims but agents, capable of striking back, even if the price was death. And perhaps most chilling is this: folklore insists she never died entirely. In some tellings she was executed, her body left hanging. In others she escaped into the swamps, becoming a ghostly figure who poisoned again and again, her legend growing with each retelling. Whether ghost, martyr, or rebel, she refused erasure. Her memory outlived the masters who condemned her, the overseers who whipped her, the clerks who burned her records. So when we listen to the folklore, we hear more than one girl's act. We hear an entire community refusing to forget, even when forgetting was demanded by law, by lash, by fire. We hear survival encoded not in ledgers but in lullabies. We hear a name erased, returned to life through whispers. The cook's daughter may have been buried in silence, but the people remembered. And in remembering they defied the erasure itself. The cook's daughter's act was not an isolated spark in a dark field. It was one ember among thousands, part of a pattern stretching across the American South, a hidden map of defiance that the planters tried desperately to deny. To understand her fully, we must place her alongside the countless others who, in whispers or in fire, proved that slavery was never passive submission, it was constant resistance. The masters called these acts insolence, crime, or malady. The enslaved remembered them as survival, rebellion, vengeance. The archives, when read closely, reveal fragments of this wider pattern. In Louisiana alone, records from the 1820s and 1830s mention suspicion of poisoning dozens of times. Overseer diaries from Point Capee Parish note, Negro woman whipped for administering bitter herbs to master's tea. In Iberville, a planter's letter laments, a servant near Baton Rouge nearly brought me to grave with tainted broth. By God's mercy discovered in time. These words, dry on the page, conceal the terror that planters lived with, the knowledge that the food on their plates, the drink in their cups, the very bread they broke could carry rebellion in its crust. And it was not only poison. The largest slave revolt in American history had already shaken Louisiana 2 decades earlier. In 1811, along the German coast, hundreds of enslaved men and women rose with cane knives and muskets, marching toward New Orleans before being brutally crushed. Court transcripts from that rebellion list nearly 100 executed, their heads mounted on pikes along the river. Though planters called it an isolated insurrection, it lived in memory as proof that even the most rigid chains could shatter. The cook's daughter's act, though smaller in scale, followed the same current of resistance, a current always flowing beneath the surface. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831 had terrified the South in similar ways. Newspapers from Charleston to New Orleans reprinted every lurid detail. Families slaughtered, plantations overturned, a preacher claiming visions from God leading his people into judgment. The retaliation was swift, hundreds executed, even more whipped or sold, but the memory lingered. Planters spoke of Turner's ghost as if it haunted their fields. Every rumor of a gathering, every whisper of a hymn sung too boldly, was met with panic. It was within this climate of fear that the cook's daughter lived. She was part of a lineage of resistance, whether or not she ever heard Turner's name. There were countless smaller acts as well, acts that never reached newspapers or dockets but lived in folklore. Fields mysteriously set ablaze. Tools broken. Horses released in the night. Food spoiled, medicine stolen. The Federal Writers Project interviews conducted in the 1930s recorded elders who recalled, sometimes the women slipped things in the food. Sometimes a mule got loose on purpose. We done what we could even if it weren't but little. Each small act was a strike against a system that claimed total control, proof that total control was a lie. The cook's daughter, then, was not a solitary figure but part of this mosaic. She carried forward the knowledge passed quietly among enslaved women, that kitchens could be battlefields, that herbs could serve as weapons, that silence could conceal rebellion until the right moment. In her bread was not only her grief, but centuries of accumulated rage, centuries of whispered strategies that planters dismissed as superstition but feared in their bones. The suppression of her story makes sense when seen in this light. To admit that one girl poisoned bread was to admit that every girl might do the same. To admit that one kitchen child could topple a master's house was to admit that the system itself was fragile, sustained only by violence and fear. If her story had been widely known, it might have emboldened others. Suppression was not only about her. It was about the pattern, about severing the chain of resistance before it grew too visible. But the pattern could not be fully hidden. Even in the censored language of newspapers, traces remain. The Charleston Mercury in 1840 warned planters to be vigilant, for the poisonings in Louisiana are not the first, nor will they be the last. That single line betrays what the South feared most. Not isolated madness but coordinated defiance. A conspiracy written not in pamphlets but in recipes, in herbs, in fire. The folklore of black communities confirms this. In song after song, bread, water, and fire appear as symbols of resistance. One spiritual carried in Louisiana contained the line, "Bread gonna rise, Pharaoh gonna fall." Another sang of the bitter cup that the master would drink. These were not accidents of metaphor. They were coded memory, testifying to a truth the archives tried to smother, that kitchens and fields alike were places of rebellion. The cook's daughter stands therefore not as a lonely ghost but as part of a crowd of shadows, thousands strong, each one striking where they could, when they could. Some acts were grand, Turner's uprising, the German coast revolt. Others were as quiet as slipping bitter leaves into a stew. But together they form a map of defiance stretching across the South, a pattern the masters could not fully contain, no matter how many whips they cracked, how many gallows they raised, how many courthouses they burned. In this way her story is both singular and universal. Singular in its detail, the bread, the dining hall, the girl's trembling hands steady with resolve. Universal in its meaning, a child turned rebel, a life erased yet remembered, a moment of defiance among countless others. She was not alone. She never was. And perhaps that is what terrified the masters most. Not the bread itself, not the deaths it caused, but the realization that behind every bowed head in the field, behind every lowered eye in the kitchen, there might be another storm waiting. That what they mistook for silence was only patience, that what they mistook for obedience was only survival. The pattern is clear if we dare to look. And once we see it, we cannot unsee it. The cook's daughter was not an exception. She was the rule, a reminder that wherever there is oppression, there will be resistance even if it must hide in the crust of bread. The story of the cook's daughter does not end with her trial, her execution, or the burning of the courthouse ledgers. It does not end with the master's obituary declaring untimely illness. It does not end with the overseer's journals or the newspapers that turned poison into cholera, rebellion into malady. For if history were only the records of the powerful, she would be gone forever. But history lives also in whispers, in scars, in fragments carried through song and story. And in those places she is not gone. She is buried, yes, but not gone. Her silence in the archive is its own kind of testimony. Each missing name, each crossed-out line, each courthouse fire tells us more than ink ever could. They reveal the fear of those who ruled, the fragility of their empire, the desperation with which they tried to erase the truth. Suppression is a confession, and in that confession, her presence remains. The cook's daughter haunts the record not by what it says but by what it refuses to say. What she did that night in 1839 was not madness, not hysteria, not a crime in the sense the masters named it. It was an act of war fought with the tools she had. A crust of bread became her blade. A kitchen became her battlefield. And though she may have been only 16, she understood something that generations of enslaved people carried in their marrow, that survival could not only mean endurance. Sometimes survival meant striking back. Her death, brutal and unrecorded, was meant to silence her forever. But death could not finish what she began. Folklore kept her alive, ghostly, half-remembered, blurred into myth, but alive. Mothers told their children of the bread girl so they would know both the danger of defiance and its power. Preachers folded her into sermons as a parable of God's judgment upon Pharaoh. Descendants whispered her story as proof that they had not been merely victims, but fighters in ways both small and great. Her story reminds us of something larger, that slavery was never an unbroken silence. Beneath every lash was resistance. Beneath every ledger was a hidden name. Beneath every act of suppression was the memory of rebellion. The cook's daughter is one figure among many, but she embodies the larger truth, that those enslaved were not only acted upon but acting, not only erased but writing themselves in the margins where they could. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, we reconstruct her life from scraps. Census rolls that reduce her to female mulatto aged 15, a will that lists her as wench and issue, an overseer's line about insolence, a newspaper's coy reference to indiscretion. We take these scraps and through them, we piece together the shadow of a girl who dared to strike. And in doing so, we confront not only her erasure but the machinery that tried to make her vanish. Her story forces us to ask haunting questions. How many other acts like hers were buried in courthouse fires? How many other girls slipped herbs into stews, only for the record to call it fever? How many families whispered stories that never reached pen or print? If this one story survived in fragments, how many thousands more are gone entirely, scattered into silence by the very violence they resisted? And yet, perhaps the very incompleteness of her story is what gives it power. She is not fixed in history's stone. She is fluid, shifting between fact and folklore, haunting the line between record and memory. She is absence that demands attention, silence that insists on being heard. And in that haunting, she achieves what no ledger could ever allow. She becomes not only a girl of 1839 but a symbol of all who resisted in silence. The cook's daughter was buried twice. Once in her body, condemned by the rope or the lash. And again in the fire of the archive, her name consigned to ash. But both burials failed. For here she is, dragged from the shadows, retold, reassembled, reborn in the very act of remembering. Each time her story is spoken, she defies the erasure once more. And so we end where we began, in that dining hall, the master's laughter cut short, the bread rising golden on the table, the girl watching with steady eyes. That moment lingers still, a crack in the edifice of slavery, a reminder that even in its darkest corners resistance lived. Her act was buried, but it was not gone. If your family ever whispered about a night like this, if you've seen a name scratched out of an old Bible, or heard your grandmother warn against bread that carried secrets, write it below. And subscribe, because every voice, every comment, every memory brings another erased story back into the light. Because she is not gone. She was never gone. She was only waiting, buried in silence, until we were ready to hear her again.